A lump of sand transformed into a radiant window is pure alchemy. Medieval glassmakers perfected this art, yet their most crucial techniques vanished for centuries. By the end of this journey, you will understand the fiercely guarded secrets that let them turn earth into light. How did nomadic families in deep forests produce glass with a ghostly green glow? And why would a powerful republic threaten to kill its own artisans to protect their methods? What forgotten human skill do you think is most essential to creating lasting beauty? This transformation began with the most humble of ingredients, common sand. Yet not all sand was created equal in the eyes of a medieval glassmaker. They sought out specific deposits, often from riverbeds or certain coastal areas, where the sand was rich in silica. Silica is the essential backbone of glass, a stubborn mineral that resists melting on its own. To coax it into fusion, the craftsman needed a powerful helper, a substance called a flux. This was typically potash, created by burning vast quantities of wood or ferns and leaching the ashes. The potash acted like a key, dramatically lowering the melting point of the sand so it would fuse in their wood-fired furnaces. But this mixture was still unstable, prone to dissolving in water or crumbling over time. The final, secret ingredient was a stabilizer, often lime, which might be naturally present in the sand or added from crushed seashells. This trio of earth, fire, and water was understood not through chemistry, but through the mystical lens of alchemy. The glassmaker was seen as a wizard, performing a kind of magic by transforming a solid, opaque substance into a liquid, radiant one. The quality of the local sand dictated everything. Sand with traces of iron, for instance, would produce that distinct ghostly green glass seen in early medieval windows, while purer sands from a secret location could yield a much clearer, more brilliant material. Their entire art was rooted in the very earth beneath their feet, a recipe guarded as closely as any spell. This furnace was more than just an oven, it was the beating heart of the entire workshop, a complex and costly structure built from brick and fire clay. At its core was the pot furnace, a domed chamber where special clay pots, called crucibles, held the raw batch of sand and flux. These pots had to withstand unimaginable heat without cracking or contaminating the precious melt inside. Right beside it stood another crucial structure, the annealing furnace, sometimes called a layer. Once a piece of glass was shaped, it couldn't simply be left to cool in the open air. The sudden temperature change would make it crack into 1,000 pieces. Instead, it was placed into the gentle, steady heat of the layer, where it would cool down over many hours, sometimes even days. This slow cooling, a process known as annealing, relieved the internal stresses in the glass, turning a brittle object into a durable masterpiece. Maintaining these temperatures demanded an immense amount of fuel. A single furnace could devour an entire forest over just a few months. This is why glassmakers were often nomads, setting up their temporary workshops deep within wooded areas, only to move on once they had consumed all the available timber. The fire itself was a living entity that required constant, round-the-clock attention. Teams of workers would labor in shifts, feeding the flames to maintain a perfect, searing heat that could reach over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Judging this temperature was an art in itself. There were no digital readouts or thermometers. A master glassmaker learned to read the fire's color, from a dull red to a blinding, brilliant white, and even the sound of the molten glass bubbling within the pots. This intimate knowledge of the flame was one of the workshop's most fiercely guarded secrets, passed down from master to apprentice through whispered lessons in the hellish glow of the furnace. Out in the deep, shadowed forests of medieval Europe, the glassmaker's fire was a temporary and wandering star. These nomadic artisans were the sole producers of a material known as wallglas, or forest glass. Entire families or small guilds would travel as a self-contained unit, carrying their most vital tools and their most precious asset, their knowledge, from one wooded haven to the next. Their entire operation was dictated by the land. They would choose a site with two essential resources, an immense supply of wood to feed the insatiable furnace, and a rich growth of ferns or specific trees to burn for their potash. They would build their clay and brick furnaces from local materials, knowing they would abandon them in a matter of months, moving on once they had consumed all the available fuel. The glass they produced in these woodland workshops had a distinct, ghostly green tint. This was not a choice of style, but a signature of the earth itself. Iron impurities, naturally present in the local sands, infused the molten glass with that characteristic pale green hue, a color that now whispers to us across the centuries from the windows of remote monasteries and churches. This nomadic existence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, their constant movement acted as a slow human network, spreading core techniques and styles across vast regions as they traveled from patron to patron. Yet, living and working in such isolated, tight-knit groups made their collective knowledge intensely secretive and insular. A master would teach his sons and perhaps a trusted apprentice, but the greater mysteries of the flame and the formula were guarded within the family, as valuable and portable as any treasure. How did a single craft manage to be both a traveler and a hermit, simultaneously connecting a continent while locking its deepest secrets away in the hearts of a few? The true magic of the glassmaker, however, resided not in the furnace alone, but in the simple iron instruments they wielded with a lifetime of practiced skill. Their most iconic tool was the blowpipe, a hollow iron tube 4 or 5 feet long. A craftsman, known as a gaffer, would carefully dip one end of this pipe into a pot of molten glass, gathering a glowing, honey-like gather on its tip. Then, with a gentle, controlled breath, he would inflate this gather into a bubble, the fundamental act that transformed a lump of hot material into a vessel of air and light. This single tool was the key to creating nearly every hollow form, from a humble drinking cup to the base cylinder that would become a sheet of window glass. But the blowpipe was just the beginning of a family of specialized tools. The newly gathered glass was immediately rolled on a flat, polished stone slab called a marver. This crucial step cooled the surface just enough to create a skin, giving the gaffer a stable foundation to begin shaping. Then came the pucellas, which were essentially massive, long-handled tweezers. With these, he could pinch, pull, and manipulate the molten glass, forming stems for goblets or creating decorative handles. Once the main body of a piece was shaped, a second tool took over, the pontil. This was a solid iron rod that would be stuck to the bottom of the vessel, allowing the gaffer to snap it off the blowpipe and hold it securely while he finished the rim, fire polishing the edge to smooth perfection. The true secret was not in the complexity of these tools, for they were fundamentally simple objects of iron and stone. The art was in the gaffer's intimate, physical conversation with the material. He learned to feel the glass's changing state through the subtle vibrations in the iron pipe, to judge its temperature by its color and its flow, and to move with a rhythm that kept the molten form centered and balanced against the relentless pull of gravity. This mastery, this dance of hand, tool, and fire, was a knowledge written in muscle and nerve, a skill that could only be earned through decades of patience and failure. With these few basic instruments, a master could create forms of breathtaking complexity and fragility, each piece a testament to a human hand guiding liquid stone into permanence. That steady, controlled breath was the invisible force shaping the final form. The glassblower's lungs were as much a tool as the iron pipe in his hands. He had to master a delicate balance of pressure and duration, a constant, gentle stream of air that would coax the molten gather into a perfect, symmetrical bubble. A single sharp puff would create a weak, thin spot destined to crack. A hesitant, uneven breath would result in a lopsided vessel, its walls thick on one side and dangerously thin on the other. The entire character of the piece, from a delicate drinking flute to a sturdy storage jar, was born from this intimate control. This was not a skill learned quickly. It demanded immense physical endurance. The gaffer stood for hours in the blistering heat of the glory hole. The furnace used to reheat the glass, his lungs working against the oppressive air. His breath had to remain steady even as sweat poured down his face and his muscles ached from holding the heavy, rotating pipe. A sudden cough, a sneeze, or even a moment of lost concentration could send a day's work shattering onto the workshop floor. This is why the master-apprentice relationship was so profound. An apprentice would spend years simply observing, fetching tools, and stoking fires before he was ever allowed to touch a blowpipe. His first lessons were not about shaping glass, but about breathing. He would practice on a cold pipe, learning the feel of a long, sustained exhale, developing the lung capacity and rhythmic control that separated a craftsman from a novice. The master would watch, not just the glass, but the subtle rise and fall of the apprentice's chest, judging his readiness for the molten gather. This intangible secret, the art of the breath, could never be written down in a recipe book. It was a living knowledge, passed directly from one set of lungs to another, a whisper of air that gave life to form and light. Hidden within every new piece of glass was the ghost of the old. The secret ingredient that made the entire alchemical process more reliable was cullet, the crushed fragments of broken glass from failed pieces or discarded waste. This was not merely an act of medieval recycling, born from simple frugality. Cullet served a profound chemical purpose. When added to the raw batch of sand and potash, these fragments of pre-made glass acted as a powerful catalyst. They provided a ready-made structure that the molten mixture could latch onto, dramatically lowering the energy and temperature required to achieve a full fusion. The furnace did not need to work as hard or as long, saving precious fuel and reducing the strain on the fragile clay pots. More importantly, the cullet helped the melt become more homogeneous, stirring itself into a more uniform liquid that was far less likely to develop seeds, which are tiny trapped air bubbles, or stones, which are unmelted bits of sand. This resulted in a clearer, stronger final product. Yet this practice created a hidden signature. Every workshop's stockpile of cullet was unique, a blend of their own past successes and failures. The specific green tint of their walgelas, the accidental inclusion of other colors, and the precise mineral makeup of their previous batches all became part of this recycled material. When melted down together, this specific cullet blend would subtly influence the color, clarity, and working properties of the new glass. A master glassmaker knew his own cullet like a baker knows his sourdough starter. It was a living recipe, a trade secret as carefully managed as the formula for the batch itself. Controlling the cullet meant controlling the consistency of their craft, turning the broken remnants of the past into the flawless potential of the future. But that glowing bubble of glass was often just a canvas waiting for its true color. The transformation from a ghostly green walgelas to a deep sapphire blue or a fiery ruby red was the pinnacle of the glassmaker's alchemical art. This was where they truly separated the masters from the apprentices, a realm of secret recipes guarded with the same intensity as a state secret. The magic lay in the careful addition of metallic oxides to the molten batch. A tiny amount of cobalt oxide, a mineral painstakingly imported from distant lands, could produce an intense, unforgettable blue. Manganese, on the other hand, offered a range of regal purples and amethysts. Copper was a particularly versatile and unpredictable element. Depending on the master's skill, it could yield a vibrant emerald green or, under very specific conditions, a stunning and rare blood red. The most coveted color of all was a true ruby red, achieved not with copper, but with gold. Finely powdered gold, added in minuscule quantities, would produce a glass of such deep, luminous crimson that it was considered almost priceless. Yet adding the metal was only half the secret. The final color was a product of a delicate dance with the fire itself. The atmosphere inside the furnace was the final, invisible brushstroke. An oxidizing atmosphere, one with plenty of oxygen, would force a metal to display one set of colors. A reducing atmosphere, starved of oxygen, could trigger a completely different chemical reaction, pulling out an entirely unexpected hue from the very same metallic ingredient. A master did not just control the fire's heat, he controlled its very breath. This profound knowledge was far too valuable to write down plainly. Recipes were encoded in cryptic symbols, sketched in the margins of personal notebooks, or passed down orally from master to apprentice in whispered verses. A single misplaced word or misunderstood symbol could mean the difference between creating a masterpiece of crimson and a worthless pot of muddy brown glass. The color was not just a decoration, it was the ultimate expression of a craft steeped in mystery, a visible manifestation of the glassmaker's most closely guarded chemical secrets. Of all the colors dancing in the master's fire, none was more elusive than a true, deep ruby red. Achieving this specific crimson was the ultimate test of a glassmaker's skill, a process so fraught with failure that a successful batch felt like a miracle. Two primary paths led to this prized hue, each guarded by its own set of dangerous secrets. The first and most legendary involved gold. It was not simply gold coins tossed into the melt, but a specially prepared gold chloride. A minuscule amount of this precious substance, no more than a pinch, was enough to color an entire pot of glass. Yet the magic did not happen immediately. The glass would emerge from the furnace a pale, unremarkable yellow, sometimes even colorless. The deep red only revealed itself later, when the finished piece was reheated in a second, gentler fire in a process called striking. This second heating coaxed the tiny particles of gold to disperse and reflect light in a way that produced that legendary, luminous crimson. The second method relied on copper under a very specific reducing atmosphere, a fire deliberately starved of oxygen. In this smothering environment, copper could produce a stunning red, but the line between success and failure was razor thin. A fraction too much copper, a fire a little too hot, or a reducing phase a moment too long, and the glass would turn an opaque, muddy brown or a dull, smoky black. The color could simply burn out, leaving behind a useless, cloudy slag. Success demanded a perfect, almost intuitive balance of material, temperature, and time. There were no instruments to guide this dance, only the master's eye reading the subtle shifts in the flame's color and his deep, ingrained sense of timing. Because the outcome was so uncertain, producing a consistent ruby red was often seen less as a science and more as an arcane art, a secret knowledge whispered alongside prayers for good fortune. A single perfect piece of ruby glass was not just a product, it was a trophy, proof that the glassmaker had, for one glorious moment, tamed the most rebellious of colors. These brilliant sheets of colored glass were not the final masterpiece, but the raw canvas for an even greater art. To transform them into the luminous stories of a cathedral window, they first had to be tamed into large, flat panels. This was achieved through one of two ingenious methods, each with its own distinct character. The crown method involved blowing a large bubble of glass and then spinning it rapidly on a wheel. Centrifugal force would flatten the bubble into a large, shimmering disc, often leaving a telltale bull's-eye shape at the center where the ponto rod had been attached. These crown glass sheets were renowned for their fiery, bright quality, but their size was limited, and the central bull's eye was often discarded as waste. The cylinder method was more versatile. A glassblower would create a long, balloon-shaped cylinder, cut off its ends, and then slice it lengthwise while still hot. This single sheet was then carefully flattened in a special kiln, yielding a larger, more uniform panel of glass. Whether from a spinning crown or an unrolled cylinder, these were the pieces that would soon hold the faces of saints and the drama of Scripture. But a sheet of red or blue glass alone could not tell a story. It needed lines and shadows, expressions and folds of cloth. This was the purpose of grisaille, a mysterious paint that was the true key to painting with light. Grisaille was not a simple pigment, it was a sophisticated chemical fusion. Its base was a powder made from ground glass, identical in composition to the panel it was meant to decorate. To this, metallic oxides were added, typically iron or copper, which would provide the color after firing. The most crucial and perhaps unsettling ingredient was the medium that held it all together. The ground glass and metal powders were suspended in a liquid binder, often wine, vinegar, or sometimes even urine. This organic medium allowed the artist to paint with the grisaille like a watercolor, applying it in delicate strokes and washes. Yet at this stage, the painting was fragile, a dusty film that could be wiped away with a single touch. The true alchemy happened inside a small, specialized kiln. The painted glass panel was placed inside and slowly heated until the kiln reached a precise, critical temperature. At this moment, something miraculous occurred. The particles of ground glass in the paint would begin to melt, fusing themselves permanently to the surface of the glass panel beneath. The organic binder burned away completely, leaving no trace, while the metallic oxides melted into the surface, creating permanent lines of brown, black, or gray. This firing process transformed a temporary sketch into a part of the glass itself. A master artist could use washes of grisaille to create subtle shading, giving a saint's robe a sense of flowing movement or a face a look of serene contemplation. This was not a painting on the glass, but a painting within its very surface, a permanent stain that would stand for centuries against wind and rain. The secret was not just in the paint's recipe, but in the artist's precise control of the kiln's fire, a second, gentler flame that baked their stories into eternity. How many generations of artists learned to breathe life into their figures not with a final brushstroke, but with the perfect application of heat. This painted and fired glass was still a collection of fractured light, a story told in 100 separate pieces. The true magic of assembly belonged to the glazier, the architect of light and lead. With a full-scale drawing of the window laid out on a large wooden table, his work began. Each uniquely shaped piece of colored glass was carefully fitted into an H-shaped strip of lead, called a came. The glazier would cut these lead cames to length, pinning the entire intricate puzzle to the table as he worked, slowly building the image from the ground up. But this lead framework was far more than just a picture frame. It was the hidden skeleton that gave the window its strength and resilience. The H-shaped profile allowed the glazier to slot two separate pieces of glass into either side of the same lead strip, locking them securely in place. Each joint was then soldered, and the entire network of lead was made watertight by forcing a special cement under its flanges. This created a single, unified panel that was both rigid and remarkably flexible. When the wind howled against a cathedral wall, the massive stone structure would shift and groan. A solid pane of glass would have shattered instantly, but the leaded window could absorb these movements. The network of cames acted like a shock absorber, distributing the stress and allowing the entire panel to sway slightly in its supporting iron armature. This hidden structural genius is why these fragile-looking windows have survived centuries of storms. Beyond the structure, the glaziers often embedded a more personal secret into their work. Amidst the leaves of a stone-carved border or hidden in the folds of a saint's robe, a master might solder a tiny, personal token, a fragment of a tool, or even a coin from his own pocket into the lead. These were not just signatures, they were silent prayers and protective charms, a piece of the artisan's own world sealed within his heavenly creation. These men were more than mere craftsmen. They were the builders of heaven on earth, translating divine light into a language of color and lead that has whispered its story across 1,000 years. Even the most brilliant stained glass window was a grand spectacle, a story told on a monumental scale. But for the ultimate test of a glassmaker's foresight and control, we must look to a far more intimate art, one that created entire gardens of color within a single object. This was the secret of millefeury, a name that means 1,000 flowers. Its origins reach back to the ancient Romans, but the technique experienced a stunning revival in the late medieval period, becoming a prized demonstration of a master's skill. The process began not with a single gather of glass, but with the creation of complex canes. A glassmaker would prepare several long, thin rods of glass, each one a different, vibrant color. These colored rods were then carefully arranged side by side in a specific pattern, perhaps to form a simple star, a complex geometric shape, or the petals of a flower. This entire bundle was heated in a special furnace until the individual rods just began to soften and fuse together into a single composite rod. When this new patterned rod was pulled lengthwise, like taffy, something miraculous happened. The entire design shrunk in diameter but remained perfectly consistent along its entire length. creating a long, thin cane that held a tiny, repeating version of the original pattern running through its core. The true magic was revealed in the next step. The master would take this patterned cane and slice it into dozens, sometimes hundreds, of incredibly thin cross-sections. Each one of these tiny slices was a perfect, complete miniature of the intended design, a tiny flower or star frozen in glass. To create the final object, the glassmaker would heat a clear glass base, perhaps a bowl or a decorative bead. While the clear glass was still soft and malleable, he would carefully pick up these intricate slices with fine tweezers and press them into its surface. The heat would fuse the colorful cross-sections permanently into the clear body, creating a field of dazzling, flower-like designs that seemed to bloom from within the glass itself. The entire process was an exercise in incredible foresight. The artist had to envision the final, shrunken design while he was still arranging the thick, initial rods. He had to calculate exactly how the pattern would condense when the cane was stretched, a mental feat of geometry and scaling that separated the true masters from the merely competent. A single misjudgment in the initial layout, or an uneven pull on the molten cane, would result in a distorted, blurry pattern, rendering weeks of work worthless. This was glassmaking as microscopic architecture, a testament to the patience and spatial genius of the medieval artisan, who could build a universe of color inside a handful of glass. Yet the desire to paint with pure, unadulterated color did not stop at the surface of the glass. For the most luxurious objects, artisans developed a technique that fused pigment and form into a single, inseparable entity. This was the art of enameling, a process that painted with fire itself. The medium was not a simple paint, but a substance known as vitreous enamel. Craftsmen would take colored glass and grind it into an incredibly fine powder, creating a palette of brilliant hues. This powdered glass was then mixed with a delicate binder, often oil or gum, to form a paste that could be painted onto a finished glass object, like a beaker or a decorative flask. The true secret, however, lay in the kiln. The painted object was placed inside and heated until the powdered enamel grains began to melt. At this critical moment, they would fuse directly to the surface of the underlying glass, creating a permanent, glossy layer of color that was, in essence, a layer of glass bonded to another layer of glass. The final effect was a matter of precise chemical control. To create an opaque, solid color that completely hid the glass beneath, the enamel recipe included an opacifier, typically tin oxide. This additive scattered the light, turning a transparent glaze into a solid plane of brilliant white or vibrant color. For a translucent, jewel-like effect that allowed light to glow through, the craftsman used a purer enamel without this additive. The firing temperature was the final invisible brushstroke. A lower temperature might only soften the enamel, creating a textured, matte finish. A higher, more precise heat would create a perfectly smooth, glassy surface that flowed seamlessly with the object's form. This technique became the preferred method for applying intricate, permanent designs that grisaille alone could not achieve. Heraldic coats of arms, with their precise fields of solid color and intricate animal motifs, were perfectly rendered in opaque enamels on luxurious drinking vessels. Decorative beads for jewelry were transformed into tiny, portable artworks, their surfaces alive with translucent floral patterns. This art represented a magnificent fusion of disciplines. It borrowed the metal oxides and color theories from the glassmaker's furnace and combined them with the precise, detailed hand of a miniature painter, all brought to life by the controlled fire of a kiln. An enameled goblet was more than just a cup. It was a portable canvas of fire and light, a testament to the medieval artisan's quest to make color as permanent as the object it adorned. Behind these dazzling techniques stood an institution designed to protect them at all costs. The medieval glass and glazing guilds were far more than trade associations. They were fortresses of knowledge. Their entire structure was a carefully engineered system to control the flow of information, ensuring that the alchemical secrets of the craft remained within a trusted inner circle. This began with the apprentice, a young boy bound to a master craftsman for a period of up to 7 years. He entered the workshop not as a student, but as an indentured servant. His first duties involved the most grueling and menial tasks: sweeping the workshop floor, fetching wood for the furnace, and mixing batches of sand and potash. For years, he was not allowed to touch a blowpipe or even approach the glory hole. This long, arduous initiation served a dual purpose. It provided the master with cheap labor, but more importantly, it tested the boy's character, his patience, and his dedication. The master was not just teaching a skill. He was judging whether this young man could be trusted with secrets that could make or break the entire workshop. Only after years of faithful service would the apprentice begin to learn the most basic techniques, always under the master's watchful eye. Every step was designed to weed out the unworthy and to instill a profound respect for the craft's mysteries. Upon completing his term, the apprentice would become a journeyman, a title derived from the French word for day, as he was now paid a daily wage for his labor. This was not freedom, however. A journeyman was expected to travel, to leave his home workshop and work for other masters in different cities, sometimes in different lands. This wandering period was crucial. It allowed techniques and styles to cross-pollinate across Europe, but it also prevented any single journeyman from learning all the secrets of one particular master. He might learn a new way to handle red glass in one city and a clever glazing technique in another, but the full, holistic recipe of any single workshop remained protected. The journeyman's ultimate goal was to create his masterpiece. This was not just any beautiful object. It was a specific, incredibly complex piece mandated by the guild to demonstrate complete and total mastery of the craft. For a glassmaker, it might be a perfectly formed goblet with an intricate stem, or a sealed flask with an internal decoration. For a glazier, it could be a detailed stained glass panel depicting a specific religious scene. The masterpiece had to be flawless, a testament to years of accumulated skill. Only after the guild masters inspected and approved this work could the journeyman apply for full mastership, a status that granted him the right to open his own workshop and take on his own apprentices, thus continuing the cycle. The guild's power extended far beyond education. It was an economic and legal monopoly. Guilds set strict quality standards, inspecting finished glass for bubbles, discoloration, or weak spots. They fixed prices to prevent undercutting and maintained a stable market for their members, but their most ferocious efforts were reserved for guarding their technical knowledge. Guild statutes were filled with rules forbidding the sharing of recipes with outsiders. In some cities, a master could be heavily fined, imprisoned, or even banished for revealing the secrets of color making or enamel formulas to anyone outside the guild. They were particularly vigilant against industrial espionage from rival cities. A glassmaker traveling to a competing region might be followed, his tools searched, and his contacts scrutinized. This obsessive secrecy was not paranoia, it was economic survival. The formula for a perfect ruby red or a durable clear glass was not just a clever trick, it was the lifeblood of a city's luxury trade, a commercial advantage as valuable as a gold mine. The guild system, for all its rigidity, was the armored shell that protected the fragile, brilliant art of glassmaking, ensuring that its light would not be extinguished by carelessness or theft. How many brilliant recipes died with a master who never found a worthy successor, forever lost behind the guild's impenetrable walls? While the guilds guarded their secrets with fierce silence, another kind of workshop was diligently preserving this knowledge for a very different purpose. Behind the high walls of monasteries, monks were compiling the era's most comprehensive technical manuals, turning oral craft into written scripture. These monastic manuscripts offer us the closest thing we have to a direct conversation with a medieval master. The most famous of these is the Schedula Diversarum Artium, written in the early 12th century by a German monk known as Theophilus Presbyter. His work is not a dry list of instructions. It is a passionate, first-hand guide to the arts, including an incredibly detailed chapter on the entire craft of glassmaking. Theophilus does not just tell you to build a furnace. He describes its exact dimensions, the type of bricks and clay to use, and even the precise slope of the furnace floor to manage the intense heat. He explains how to construct the clay pots for the molten glass, warning of the specific impurities that will cause them to crack under thermal stress. He then walks the reader through every step, from gathering the sand and burning ferns for potash, to the final blowing and shaping of a vessel. For modern historians, this text is a treasure map. It provides the crucial, practical details that were considered too basic to be worth mentioning in secretive guild circles. Theophilus was writing to glorify God by documenting the beauty of human craftsmanship, not to protect a commercial monopoly. His motive was preservation and instruction for the faithful, which is why he held nothing back. He reveals the recipe for a clear glass, instructions for coloring it with copper and manganese, and the method for creating flashed glass, where a thin layer of colored glass is bonded to a clear base. These written words become the key that unlocks the silent archaeology of old furnace sites and glass fragments. When we find the remains of a medieval workshop, it is Theophilus who helps us understand the soot patterns on the walls and the specific composition of the clay crucibles. His manuscript is a bridge across 8 centuries, a single voice that explains the roar of the furnace, the smell of the boiling potash, and the careful patience required to open a furnace door at just the right moment. These monastic texts were often the only written records of techniques that were otherwise passed from hand to hand in a fiery glow. They serve as fixed points in a fluid oral tradition, giving us the clues we need to reconstruct methods that the guilds believed were lost forever. A single city-state would go further than any guild, turning its entire glassmaking industry into a fortress surrounded by water. In 1291, the Venetian Republic issued a stunning decree. Every glass furnace within the city of Venice was to be dismantled and moved to the nearby island of Murano. The official reason was the very real danger of fire, as the city's tightly packed wooden buildings were perpetually at risk from the roaring furnaces. But the true motive was far more calculated. By isolating the glassmakers on an island, the Venetian state could control them with absolute authority. This was not just about protecting the city from flames, it was about protecting a trade secret from leaving the Republic. On Murano, the glassmakers lived in a gilded cage. They enjoyed immense social privileges, including the right to marry into noble families, a status unthinkable for most craftsmen elsewhere. Yet they were forbidden on pain of death from leaving the Republic. If a master glassmaker tried to flee with his knowledge, the state would dispatch assassins to ensure the secret died with him. This extreme isolation allowed for an unprecedented concentration of talent and collaboration. The best masters were all living and working in one small community, sharing ideas and refining techniques in a hothouse of innovation, all under the watchful eye of the state. The ultimate fruit of this forced collaboration was a material so perfect it seemed to defy the nature of glass itself. They called it cristallo. This was not the leaded crystal we know today, but a perfectly clear, colorless, and brilliant glass that mimicked the appearance of pure rock crystal, a semi-precious stone. Achieving this level of clarity was a chemical masterpiece. The Venetian masters had discovered that the key lay in using a specific, pure form of flux. Instead of the variable potash from burned wood, they used the ashes of sodium-rich plants that grew in the Middle East, known as soda ash. This, combined with meticulously purified silica from river pebbles, created a glass that was stable, workable, and stunningly transparent. It was also incredibly malleable when hot, allowing artisans to create forms of breathtaking thinness and complexity. A Cristallo wine glass was not merely a vessel, it was an illusion, a bubble of solidified air so delicate it seemed it might vanish at any moment. This was the secret Venice sold to the world, a luxury that proclaimed not just wealth, but a technological supremacy so profound it was worth killing for. The true marvel of Cristallo was not just its clarity, but its strange, almost liquid behavior in the hands of a master. While common forest glass was stiff and stubborn, cooling quickly on the pipe, Venetian Cristallo remained workable for an impossibly long time. This unique ductility, this willingness to be stretched and shaped, was the result of a chemical purity that bordered on obsession. It began with the sand, but the Venetians refused to call it that. They sourced their silica from the quartz pebbles of the Ticino River, stones they called cagalli. These pebbles were not simply gathered and thrown into the furnace. They were first heated to a searing temperature and then plunged into cold water, a thermal shock that caused them to fracture into a million tiny pieces. This crushed quartz was far purer than any common beach sand, virtually free of the iron impurities that gave Walgelas its green ghost. Yet even this pure silica was useless without the perfect flux. The Venetians turned away from the wood ash used in the north. Their secret ingredient was the ash of a specific salt-loving plant that grew along the coasts of the Levant, known as salicornia. This plant, burned and processed into a fine powder called soda ash, was their alchemical key. When mixed with the crushed cagalli, it created a melt that was not only brilliantly clear, but also remained fluid and malleable at a lower temperature. The master could take his time, coaxing the glass into forms of breathtaking thinness without it stiffening and shattering on the iron rod. But achieving this perfect melt was a battle against imperfection. The molten cristallo was a seething, bubbling liquid, and those bubbles were the enemy. To remove them, the master employed a technique called fining. He would add a special clearing agent to the batch, often a small piece of manganese dioxide, known as glassmakers' soap. As this additive decomposed in the intense heat, it released tiny streams of oxygen that rose through the molten glass, gathering the trapped air bubbles and carrying them to the surface to pop. The melt would then be left to simmer and settle, sometimes for an entire day, until it achieved a state of perfect, still clarity, like a pond on a windless morning. This painstaking purification process is what gave Cristallo its legendary transparency, a window pane with no green tint, no smoky haze, and no tiny seeds of trapped air to scatter the light. With this flawless, ductile material, a Venetian master could perform miracles. He could blow a bubble so large and thin it seemed to be made of breath alone, then stretch it into a long-necked flask with the grace of a swan. He could spin out delicate trails of glass as fine as thread, weaving them into intricate lacework handles that defied belief. A finished Cristallo goblet was so light it felt like holding a feather, so clear it almost disappeared when filled with wine, leaving only the shimmer of liquid suspended in air. This was the ultimate illusion, the transformation of earth and fire into something that embodied pure light. A secret so powerful it built an empire on a lagoon. But the Venetian quest for alchemical perfection did not stop at perfect transparency. In their relentless drive to dominate the luxury market, they mastered the art of deception, creating a glass so convincing it could fool the eye of a king. This secret was known as latimo, or milk glass. The goal was to replicate the most coveted ceramic in the world, pure white Chinese porcelain. At the time, porcelain was an exotic treasure, imported at immense cost along the Silk Road, and its secret formula was a mystery to European potters. The Venetian glassmakers, unable to create true porcelain, decided to create the next best thing using the material they commanded so completely: glass. Their method was chemical genius. To a standard batch of Cristallo, they added a generous amount of tin oxide. When this mixture melted, the tiny particles of tin oxide suspended within the molten glass scattered the light passing through it. Instead of being transparent, the glass became a solid, opaque white, with a soft, milky luster that closely mimicked the surface of precious porcelain. This was not a painted surface or a coating, but a transformation of the glass's very essence from the inside out. With latimo, Venetian artisans could craft vases, cups, and decorative objects that had the appearance and prestige of porcelain, but were born from their own furnaces on Murano. It was a brilliant commercial solution, allowing wealthy patrons to enjoy the aesthetic of the Far East without the exorbitant cost and uncertainty of the long trade routes. Yet the innovation did not end there. The technique of using metal oxides to create opaque, stone-like glass opened a door to even more elaborate imitations. They began experimenting with layered colored glasses, creating a material called chalcedonio. By carefully combining strands of differently colored opaque glass, often in earthy tones of brown, red, and yellow, They could mimic the intricate, swirling bands of natural semi-precious stones like agate. The process was incredibly difficult, requiring the master to merge the colored canes of glass while they were all at the perfect temperature, ensuring they bonded without blurring into a muddy mess. A successfully pulled cane, when sliced, would reveal a perfect, stone-like pattern that could then be incorporated into a dagger handle or a decorative bowl. This was the height of the glassmaker's alchemical ambition, to not only create new beauty, but to replicate and even surpass the treasures of the natural world, proving that their command of fire and sand could conjure anything from milky porcelain to the heart of the earth itself. For a master glassblower on Murano, the line between celebrated artist and state prisoner was dangerously thin. The Republic's lavish privileges were not gifts, they were chains of gilded silk. A master enjoyed status and wealth, but his life and knowledge were considered state property. The initial laws were stark warnings, forbidding any artisan from leaving Venetian territory to practice their craft elsewhere. But as the value of Cristallo soared, the penalties escalated from threats to brutal reality. The state's secret service, the Council of 10, was empowered to hunt down any glassmaker who attempted to flee. Capture could mean imprisonment in the dreaded Pazzi, the dank, waterlogged cells beneath the Doge's palace. For the most egregious cases of betrayal, the state sanctioned assassination. There are records of masters who vanished while traveling abroad, their bodies found under mysterious circumstances, a quiet and terrible message sent back to the island. The Republic was not merely punishing a crime, it was surgically removing a leak in its economic security. This created an atmosphere of constant, low-grade fear beneath the island's brilliant surface. A master could not trust a foreign merchant with a friendly smile, nor could he speak too freely after a glass of wine. His own family was his only safe confidant, for even a disgruntled apprentice might report a careless word to the authorities. The entire social fabric of Murano was woven with threads of suspicion, all designed to keep the fire of the furnace from spreading beyond the lagoon. This paranoia was justified by very real threats from the outside. Foreign powers desperately wanted to break the Venetian monopoly. Stories circulated of agents from France or the Holy Roman Empire arriving in Venice under false pretenses. These spies would attempt to bribe Murano masters with fortunes of gold, promising them estates and titles if they would just whisper the formula for Cristallo or the secret of Latimo. Some even plotted audacious kidnappings, scheming to smuggle a master glassblower onto a waiting ship under cover of night. The Venetian state responded with a relentless intelligence network of its own. Suspicious foreigners were watched, their movements tracked, and their contacts questioned. The glassmakers themselves became the first line of defense, their loyalty enforced by the certain knowledge that betrayal meant ruin or death. This climate of control, as harsh as it was, proved devastatingly effective. For nearly 3 centuries, the secrets of Venetian glass remained locked within a single small island. The techniques for Cristallo, Latimo, and their other marvels did not begin to spread through Europe until the 17th century, when political power shifted and the Republic's grip finally began to loosen. Until that moment, the most brilliant light of the glassmaking world was kept burning in a single, tightly guarded cage. While Venice guarded its secrets on an island, a rival school of glass was quietly taking root in the deep forests of Central Europe. The northern masters watched the trade in delicate Cristallo and decided on a different path altogether. Instead of competing in thinness and transparency, they would champion a new ideal of strength and brilliance. Their answer was a radical reinvention of the glass recipe itself, built from the very earth beneath their feet. Bohemian glassmakers perfected a formula using pure potash from the ashes of beechwood, creating a glass that was thicker, heavier, and possessed of a fiery, resonant clarity. This was not a material meant to mimic rock crystal, but to rival it in its own right. Its great virtue was its durability. Where a Venetian goblet might shatter from a firm tap, Bohemian glass could withstand the bite of a wheel. This unique toughness made it the perfect canvas for the engraver's art. Craftsmen used small, fast-spinning copper wheels fed with abrasive sand to cut intricate scenes into the surface, their designs catching the light with a sharp, crystalline sparkle that thin Cristallo could never achieve. They pioneered deep relief carving, transforming a simple beaker into a mountainous landscape of glass, with figures and forests standing out in bold, three-dimensional detail. Meanwhile, across the German states, another crucial innovation was emerging. For centuries, glass stability had relied on lime, often sourced from burned bones. German artisans made a simple yet profound switch, sourcing their lime directly from plentiful local deposits of limestone. This purer, more consistent source of calcium oxide created a glass that was not only more stable and less prone to dissolving, but also had a higher refractive index. In plain terms, it sparkled more. It caught the light with a harder, more diamond-like fire, a quality that made it ideal for the lavish, Baroque-style engraving that was becoming the fashion in northern courts. A German engraved goblet was a statement of power and permanence, its hefty feel and brilliant cut facets proclaiming a different kind of luxury, one born not from delicate illusion, but from solid, monumental skill. The story of medieval glass is not one of a single secret, but of many. In Venice, the secret was clarity and control. In the north, it was strength and sparkle, a testament to how the same elemental ingredients could be coaxed into utterly different forms of beauty by the will of the artisans who commanded the fire. The cold remains of a medieval glass workshop tell a story in broken pieces. An archaeologist's first clues are often scattered across a patch of disturbed earth, fragments of the very vessels that once held liquid light. The most telling artifacts are the shattered crucibles, those clay pots that braved the furnace's heart. Their broken edges reveal a cross-section of their history, with the inner surface often glazed to a glassy sheen from the intense, prolonged heat. This vitrified lining is a permanent record of the temperatures it endured. Even the furnace itself leaves a ghostly imprint. Its brick and clay walls bear a thick, slag-like crust, a melted residue of ash, sand, and flux that dripped and fused during operation. This waste material, often dismissed as simple slag, is a chemical time capsule. By taking tiny samples of this crust and the vitrified crucible clay, scientists can perform a kind of reverse alchemy. Using instruments that measure elemental composition, they can identify the specific minerals in the original clay, revealing where the potters sourced their materials. They can detect the trace elements left by the wood ash, telling us what kind of trees fed the flames, whether it was oak from a dense forest or beech from a hillside. Most remarkably, they can estimate the furnace's operating temperature by analyzing the degree of vitrification, understanding just how close to melting point those clay walls were pushed. The piles of waste glass, the misfired lumps and discarded threads are equally eloquent. Their color and clarity speak volumes about the raw recipe. A deep green hue points to iron-rich sand, while a bubbly, cloudy texture suggests a problem with the fining process or an impure flux. Each fragment, no matter how small, is a data point. By mapping the distribution of these finds, archaeologists can reconstruct the entire workshop layout, identifying where the raw batch was mixed, where the main furnace stood, and where the finished pieces were slowly cooled in the annealing oven. These physical clues allow us to reverse engineer the glassmaker's craft, transforming piles of rubble and slag into a detailed understanding of their technical skill, their material choices, and the very air that once roared within their fires. This silent evidence from ancient workshops finds its voice in the fires of modern experiments. A fascinating field known as experimental archaeology is dedicated to rebuilding the past, not in books, but in brick and flame. Teams of historians and master craftsmen join forces to construct full-scale replica, medieval furnaces, using only the materials and tools that would have been available centuries ago. Their goal is not just to observe, but to feel the same heat and face the same stubborn challenges as a medieval glassmaker. The first major hurdle is sourcing authentic materials. They cannot simply order a bag of pure silica sand from a chemical supplier. They must find a local river deposit, test its composition, and process it by hand, just as the medieval artisans did. They gather specific trees and ferns, burning them in open pits to create their own potash, learning through failure which plants yield the best flux. Every ingredient is a question, and the furnace itself is the ultimate test. Building a structurally sound furnace from fire, clay, and brick without modern engineering is a monumental task. The first attempts often crack under the thermal stress, the walls buckling from the intense, sustained heat. Then comes the true trial, the firing. There are no thermocouples or digital gauges to guide them. The team must learn to read the fire exactly as a medieval master would, by the color of the flames and the glow of the interior bricks. They discover that maintaining a steady temperature of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit is a relentless, physical ordeal. Teams of volunteers work in rotating shifts, feeding wood into the firebox day and night, their faces scorched by the radiant heat, their bodies aching from the effort. It is in this crucible of direct experience that long-held theories are proven or shattered. For instance, the role of cullet becomes viscerally clear. In an experimental melt without any recycled glass, the batch is sluggish and stubborn, full of unmelted grains and tiny bubbles. But when crushed cullet is added to the mix, the transformation is dramatic. The melt becomes fluid and homogeneous far more quickly, proving that this was not just a thrifty practice, but a vital technical step that saved precious fuel and improved quality. The physical act of glassblowing on these replica pipes provides the most humbling insights. A modern glassblower, skilled with consistent, factory-made materials, quickly discovers that medieval glass is a wild, unpredictable partner. The gather cools at a different rate, its viscosity changing from moment to moment. Creating a simple, symmetrical drinking vessel becomes a Herculean task. The slightest miscalculation in breath or rotation results in a lopsided, hopelessly deformed object. These failed experiments are not disappointments, they are revelations. Each asymmetrical bowl and burst bubble is tangible proof of the immense, hard-won skill embedded in every surviving medieval artifact. It was not magic, but a mastery forged in the relentless, hands-on battle with fire and liquid stone. How many lifetimes of failure were condensed into the knowledge required to produce a single perfect goblet? A tiny fragment of glass, no bigger than a fingernail, can now confess its deepest secrets. Modern science provides the tools to listen, translating the silent language of its atoms into a detailed biography. Techniques like X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, allow researchers to point a handheld device at a medieval shard and within seconds receive a complete readout of its elemental composition. It is a kind of alchemy in reverse, turning solid matter back into a list of ingredients. This analysis can pinpoint the exact geographic origin of the sand used to make the glass. Every river and every coastline has a unique chemical fingerprint, a specific blend of trace elements like zirconium and titanium that acts like a postal code etched into the silica. By matching the fingerprint of the glass to the fingerprint of a known sand deposit, scientists can trace a piece of Walglas back to a specific forest in Bohemia or a stretch of the Rhine Valley. This same elemental scan reveals the specific colorants a master used. It can distinguish between a red made with copper and the far more expensive red made with gold, confirming the lavish expense of a particular cathedral window. Perhaps most remarkably, this technology can even detect the ghostly presence of cullet, the recycled glass. The analysis might show an unusually high level of a particular metal, like manganese, that does not fit the primary recipe. This anomaly is the chemical echo of a previous, failed batch being melted down and born again. This scientific detective work does more than just confirm the written accounts of monks like Theophilus. It reveals secrets the glassmakers themselves may not have fully understood. A master knew that sand from one location produced a better green, but he did not know it was because of a specific trace amount of iron. He knew his glass was more stable when he used ash from a certain plant, but he could not identify the precise potassium compounds that made the difference. Science now reads the fine print of their craft, details they perceived only through instinct and generations of trial and error. Their hands knew the recipe, but we can now read the text. Those soaring cathedrals of the High Middle Ages were more than just houses of worship. They were monuments built for light. The theological desire to fill sacred spaces with divine, colored illumination created an architectural problem of immense scale. How do you build a stone wall that is mostly window? The solution was the Gothic Revolution, a cascade of engineering innovations all, in a very real sense, driven by the demands of glass. The pointed arch distributed weight more efficiently than the rounded Romanesque arch. The flying buttress, that skeletal stone armature on the outside of the building, acted as a brace, catching the thrust of the roof and walls and freeing the interior from the need for massive, solid supports. This skeletal stone cage allowed for walls to be pierced with enormous openings, vast stone frames waiting to be filled with the jeweled light of stained glass. The cathedral was not a structure that merely contained windows. It was a structure designed to be a window, a breathtaking collaboration between the architect's stone and the glassmaker's fire. This partnership pushed both crafts to their absolute limits, forcing masons to calculate stresses they could not fully measure and compelling glassmakers to produce sheets of colored glass on a scale never before attempted. The result was a new kind of space, where light itself became the primary building material, a direct consequence of the alchemist's ability to turn sand into visions. All those centuries of empirical tinkering, of carefully noting what happened when you added this ash or that metal to the melt, were slowly building a library of chemical knowledge. The medieval glassmaker was not a scientist in the modern sense. He had no theory of elements or molecular bonds, yet, through relentless, hands-on experimentation, he was mapping the very territory that chemistry would later claim. His workshop was a laboratory. He understood that certain minerals, when added to his melt, would consistently produce specific colors, a fundamental exploration of the properties of metallic oxides. He knew that controlling the atmosphere of his furnace, whether it was oxygen-rich or starved of air, could dramatically alter the outcome of a reaction, a practical grasp of redox chemistry. He mastered the use of fluxes to lower melting points and stabilizers to prevent his glass from dissolving, all without knowing the precise physics involved. This vast body of practical, recipe-based knowledge became a crucial foundation. When the first true chemists began to emerge during the Renaissance and the scientific revolution, they were not starting from scratch. They were often studying the long-established, proven techniques of the craftsmen who worked with metals, dyes, and of course, glass. The glassmaker's mysterious art provided a rich catalog of chemical phenomena waiting to be explained, a bridge from the mystical language of alchemy to the rigorous language of science. And in a beautiful, unbroken line, the breath of the medieval gaffer still fogs the pipe of the modern studio artist. The studio glass movement, which began in the 1960s, did not invent a new craft. It rediscovered an ancient one. Artists stepped away from industrial production and returned to the small batch, hands-on philosophy of the medieval workshop. They built their own furnaces, mixed their own batches, and embraced the same direct, physical conversation with molten glass. The tools are strikingly familiar: the blowpipe, the marver, the pucellas, all remain fundamentally unchanged. When a contemporary artist gathers a glowing orb of glass on the end of a pipe, she is performing the same dance with gravity and heat as a master on Murano or in a German forest. They draw direct inspiration from the old methods, reviving the intricate patterns of millefiori, experimenting with the deep, rich colors achieved with metallic oxides, and exploring the painterly effects of grisaille and enamel. The lineage is not just technical, it is spiritual. Today's artists share the same reverence for the material's unpredictable, living quality, its constant balance between control and chance. In a modern studio, surrounded by technology unknown to the medieval world, the essential truth remains: the glass still demands a human hand, a steady breath, and a respectful ear to listen to its needs. The fire that burned in the forest forges of Europe has never been extinguished. It simply found new hearths, carrying the secrets of the masters into a new millennium. The true secret of medieval glass was not a single formula, but the human spirit that refused to let it shatter. It was the endurance of the gaffer standing before a roaring furnace for 12 hours, his lungs burning as he maintained the perfect breath to shape a bubble of liquid stone. It was the ingenuity of the monk who meticulously wrote down what others only whispered, preserving a craft for future generations. And it was the relentless, often dangerous, pursuit of a beauty so profound it was deemed worth killing for, whether in the deep forests of Germany or the isolated island of Murano. These artisans did not just make objects, they performed a kind of alchemy on the human scale, transforming the most common elements of earth, sand, and ash into vessels of pure light and color. Their legacy surrounds us even now, not only in the jeweled windows of Chartres or Canterbury, but in the very science of materials that built our modern world. Every time we look through a pane of glass, we are seeing the world through a medium they perfected. So what hidden history would you like us to uncover next? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the